Productive Pastor, why things need to be reborn. A challenge arises when we make something over a long period of time. As we evolve, we add experiences, impressions, memories, deepening knowledge, and self-knowledge to the combinatorial pool from which all creative work springs. What we make evolves accordingly. It must if we're living widely and wisely enough. Eventually, the name we once chose for it begins to feel not like a choice, but like a constraint. An ill-fitting corset ribbed with the ossified sensibilities of a former self. Joan Didion may be right that we are well advised to keep on nodding terms with the people we used to be, whether we find them attractive company or not. We are also well advised to welcome with a large-hearted embrace the blooming possibilities within us. The people we are in the ongoing course of becoming, the people we will have been, when we get our atoms to give away to our afterglow. It's a quote from Maria Popova with The Marginalian. And I was thinking through what these first few episodes, if not the whole first season, and if to be honest, the whole idea of bringing Productive Pastor back, I had thoughts like these running through my head. I was in the prep season for this, and I came across an article from Maria, the writer who published a fantastic marginalia-related website called Brain Pickings for years. And I cruised over to it for the first time in ages, mainly because she had fallen off of my algorithm, and I always enjoyed her content. And I don't know what her Strength Finder's profile is, but I bet she has a learner pretty high up. And anyway, I found this article explaining why she changed the name to The Marginalian, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. And while I did consider changing the name of this whole project and totally starting off new, I realized that it wouldn't be the best idea. The piece of honesty that I had, the former understanding of it all, the changes that I had to make because of all of those things, they really are what reformed my ideas of productivity and ministry. So to try to explain all of that, and I feel like I really have to, I wanted to find someone who knew me, who knew the community, who got the picture before, but also got the after picture, and to have that person interview me. My friend Omar Al-Rikabi is a Methodist pastor in Dallas, and we kind of passed each other in seminary. He was leaving and I was coming, and we both worked for J.D. Walt, and we took part in a few special projects over the course of a couple of months that can still be found on the depths of YouTube. And I'll link those in the show notes for anyone who gets that curious over this. So Omar called me, and we had a really nice long chat, and some of it was around COVID-19 and ministry, and that's edited out. But you can find the audio track in the Productive Pastor community. We talked about why I got out. We talked about the things that changed in my own life over the last few years and why I decided to get back in. And to be honest with you, this whole conversation was very cathartic, not just content related. But if you're enjoying and you're excited about this content, do me a favor, subscribe to the show wherever you're listening, give it a review. It helps the show out, it helps us grow the community. And so I'm not going to dawdle around any longer on it. I'm going to go straight into my conversation with my friend Omar about how the Productive Pastor started, what it meant, and also why I quit and why I felt the need to bring it back. So buckle in. It's a long one. We're scheduling this for the day after Thanksgiving.
Wow.
But no, yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing. About 6 months ago, I started having just conversations and thoughts and talking with people I knew, other colleagues. I actually have a pastor friend here in Louisiana that I told him a couple of years ago. I said, "Hey, listen, if you hear me talk about bringing this back, you need to tell me to stop." Okay.
I was going to say, I appreciate that, but tell me why you stopped in the first place.
Well, okay, so it was kind of a long time coming, but there was like the soft unofficial stop, and then there was the apocalyptic stop.
Mm-hmm.
In podcasting, there's this term pod fade. And Productive Pastor started when I was an associate pastor at a church, and I was a little bored. And back then, Twitter was a very different animal than it is now. And I was just kind of always talking about productivity hacks and that sort of a thing. And my journey into productivity is like an engineer. Like, productivity now is a very different thing than productivity was 10 years ago.
Right.
And I got into it because really I was an artist. I'm a creative. Like, if I had to, like, on that kind of a spectrum, you're either an engineer or you're an artist. Like, I'm very much into the artistic space of it. And I was fascinated with visual artists and writers and like public thinkers, like that sort of thing. I was fascinated with their morning routines
mm-hmm.
and of how they were using, and how head people, but in that brain space, were looking at the power of habit and routine and that sort of a thing to keep themselves in their best version of who they were. And so that's kind of the short version. I was just sharing this stuff on Twitter, and people kept talking to me like, hey, I was already podcasting, Threshing Floor was going, that kind of a thing. People kept telling me, hey, you need to do another podcast. And we started using the hashtag Productive Pastor as a joke, and it kind of took off. And so I launched this thing thinking like, okay, I've got 10 episodes in me, and that's really about it. And back then, remember, Omar, podcasts, they went on forever.
Right.
And they were like a once a month thing, or like a once every other week thing. Like, podcasts now are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
I think my first podcast I ever did was it was probably in 2004 or 5, before iTunes took podcasting into its ecosystem. Like, people probably don't remember this, but there was a time when you had to have a separate app on your computer to subscribe to RSS feeds to get the audio content. Then you had to drag the audio out of that program into iTunes to then either listen to it on your computer or download it to your iPod.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, like I was doing podcasts back when that was how you had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I saw Apple brought podcasts into the to their ecosystem. This was pre-iPhone. It was like, wow, this is going to be awesome. So I jumped into this thing, and I did it for years, and I did about 100 episodes, and it was it kind of changed formats. It was sometimes it was once a month, sometimes it was twice a month, sometimes for a while it was once a week. It was just kind of all over the place, and it got to the point to where I didn't realize how mentally disenfranchised I was with it. I was also really busy, and it was getting to the point to where like we started the Productive Pastor community on Facebook, which is awesome. And like that was growing. I'm really looking at like doing this at a higher level, but like life just would not allow it. So I kind of pod faded out. So episodes kind of started becoming more infrequent, that sort of thing. I think I was like 8 or 9 months without an episode when and you know about this, and probably a lot of the listeners do too, but like I went to my doctor one day thinking I had asthma or bronchitis, and I left with a diagnosis of being in stage 4 heart failure. And they said it was stress. I had some genetic issues. I'm also fat, and I live in Louisiana, so I eat sausage way too much. But the doctor primarily said this is stress. Like your stress management is out of control. And so I took a month off of work at home, and had a just incredibly spiritually formative time in that month. One of the most spiritually and deep things in my entire life. But it made me begin reevaluating a lot of things. And I talked to a mutual friend of ours, Peg Hutchins, after it. But I went on a journey of humility, and I got the feeling, okay, I need to just close this door in my life. And so I made the decision probably a month after I started going back to work again. And at this time, I'm still like, I sold my first course during this season. So like I had to it was a database course that I have continued to develop over the last few years, the methodology of it. So, but like halfway through the course, and I was like dripping and out. So like I was doing it for the very first time in front of people. And so it was much more of like a coaching alongside. Anyway, I had to like press pause on that for a month because I'd almost died. And so I finished that out. Some stuff was still running, but I was like, you know what? I'm still getting 20, 30 emails a week easy. from people asking for stuff, thinking about stuff. I was like, okay, I just need to do this. So I went in and I deleted every episode.
Oh, wow.
I deleted the show notes off of my website. Like, I tried to put this thing in the grave.
Now, let me,
it was around that.
Hold on. Sorry, I'm going to jump in here because if I remember when you called me and told me that you had this medical stuff, that was after COVID had already hit.
Mm-mm.
Was that before COVID?
It was almost exactly a year before COVID.
Oh, you know what it is? I'm confusing two different hospital events with my parents, and you called me during the first one. That was probably like September of 2019, maybe?
It was March 22nd, 2019.
Okay.
So, I mean, so COVID literally was in the first anniversary. Yeah.
Okay, so this was pre-COVID.
Yeah, this is all pre-COVID.
Okay.
And so my good friend Donnie is a pastor down in South Louisiana. He actually served the church in a different iteration of the church I serve now that I started. And I am standing where his daughter's crib was when she was a little girl, because our church office is now in the old church parsonage. But he's a good friend of mine. And I told Donnie when I shut everything down, I said, listen, man, because he was kind of walking through a bunch of stuff with me. I had a couple pastors, Donnie, my friend Katie, and then Aaron Mansfield, who we know from Kentucky. Mm-hmm. Were walking with me through a lot of that. And I told Donnie, I said, listen, man, if you hear me, if you see me on the internet starting to productive pastor, I need you to tell me to stop. And he was like, oh, yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I went on this kind of just wild personal journey that year after COVID. And then COVID happens and we all start going on wild personal journeys. Mm-hmm. You know, after a year of COVID, and, you know, for me, those first 6-8 months of COVID were navigating a church merger and then finishing a $800,000 building project, opening up a new sanctuary in the middle of a surge, closing worship down again for an additional 12 weeks, 2 days after we opened the building. You know, my church I serve, Foundry, we were online one Sunday more than we were not online during the COVID year of 2020 and 2021. So that calendar year from March 15th to March 15th, we were online one Sunday more. So like you open up a big, huge, I mean, in a new church world, opening a building, I was like, that's the thing. Like, right. That's kind of, we talk about bookends. That was one of those bookends. And so all throughout this, I'm also in just this incredibly deep. So once we got that building open, I went into a dark place. One of my staff members talks about it, and it's, you know, the idea of this. The church had been working on this for 3 years, and then we immediately have to shut it down and go into lockdown yet again. Jack, who works for the church, he said it was like we had postpartum depression, but CPS came in and took away the baby. Ooh. And so I went on this like massive journey of, you know, therapy and dealing with clinical depression. And the way that I started kind of coming out of it was a journey of, you know, self-discovery, really, of understanding my own internal wiring and that sort of thing. And multiple people who knew me started bringing up the fact of, I started looking at, I'm a massive fan of the Gallup Strength Finders model now. And it talks about energizers. And the people who know me kept talking, they started bringing up productive pastor again. And not necessarily the thing, but they're like, man, that framework that you thought of and stuff, that might be helpful for you to do that again. And, you know, COVID, I know all pastors kind of developed some new habits or whatnot during COVID. I became a thinker again. Because remember when me and you met each other years ago, 15 years ago, that's kind of was my thing. And I quit for years. Like I quit reading deeply. I quit, you know, thinking. As far as like sociologically and church theory, all these things that were really who I was years ago. And I stopped the podcast because I needed to reimagine many of those things. Right. And what I began realizing this past summer, so the summer of 2021, is that who I am it's so much of my own. I had to do identity reset, but the button now is almost out. And this way of thinking and sharing and creating and fostering these conversations, all this kind of stuff, it's a deeply huge part of who I am. And if I'm not doing it, then I'm going to be a lesser version of myself. But I had to go through this journey of almost dying, and my COVID experience, all these kinds of things, really to step back into this role in a healthy way, with a healthy understanding of myself and a healthy why do I do this. And I'm not saying it wasn't unhealthy earlier, but it wasn't right.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why that's kind of the shut it down and some of the thought process behind jumping it back in.
I remember, I'm a ridiculous U2 fan because that saved my faith when I always joke that, Petra led me to Jesus and then Jesus led me to Bono. But there was a time U2 had put out the Joshua Tree album, which is still their biggest album of all time. And they had the, Time magazine cover, Band of the Year, massive world tour, and the Rattle and Hum victory lap. And on the last show, Bono got up and said, "We've got to go away for a while and dream it all up again." And they just sort of dropped off the radar for like 4 years. And when they came back with Octoon Baby, which was just this completely different sound and look, but its core, it was still them. But it was this idea of, we've been doing this for so long this way that we have run dry. And I think that, especially as pastors who, I remember when I switched from campus ministry, which had its 4 hard seasons. You've got 13 weeks on, then you've got a month Christmas break, and then you've got 13, 14 weeks back on again. Then you've got summer break, and you're doing other kind of work during those breaks. But when I became a local church pastor, and it was like, wait, you expect a message every Sunday, all 52 of these a year? And I may not preach every single one of them, but this idea, and I'm switching my metaphors here, but I realize, like, if you're a local church pastor, and especially in smaller churches like ours, where we're like the solo pastor, everything else has seasons. You've got, football season has its off season so that bodies can recuperate. Trades can be made, drafts can happen. Hunting season has its season so that animals can reproduce. Harvesting, planting, farming has its season so the ground can recover, and because different things grow at different times of the year. And in the church industrial complex that you and I have functioned in,
my favorite words.
It's this idea that we don't get an off season. And people say, well, you get a vacation or you took a 6-week sabbatical. It's like, that was 6 weeks out of 12 years.
Yeah. And it's like, I preached a sermon years ago on Sabbath that Jessica LeGrand always brings me back to, where my bottom line was that was crashing isn't the same as resting.
Right.
I think that, even Jesus, you see, like, I read the Gospel of Mark like 4 times last month. It's kind of this thing that I do or whatever. And, in the Gospel of Mark, you really see like this pattern of Jesus, like ministering, resting. And there's this tension because the feeding of the 5,000 happened when Jesus was trying to rest.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see this massive miracle of multiplication. It's happening inside of a season where he's like, hey, I'm trying to get my people away so we can recharge to be more present with you. So like there is a seasonal and there is a Sabbathing tension.
Right.
That's inside of our lives. And so I think that's what I needed to stop this for a couple of years to make it better.
Well, I think that goes,
make it.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier in this conversation about that nurse who said there's a difference between my calling and my value.
Mm-hmm.
And pastors are taught not directly but indirectly to not really value themselves for the sake of everybody else. I remember.
We've got a jacked up understanding of personal sacrifice.
Yes.
And we have Jesus complexes.
Yes.
Like I had in the middle of kind of one of my dark spots this last year. I mean, I had one of my best leaders, one of my good friends. She'd tell me, she was like, "Hey, you've got this." She told me, she's like, "You've got a self-martyr complex."
Mm-hmm.
And like, that was a huge, huge thing that, I had to take the time to understand, because it was coming from somebody who has a clinical psychological background, who also has known me for over 10 years.
I'm going to say this, and this might have to be edited out. I don't know. But, I have been the victim, and I've done it to myself, of that. Well, they crucified Jesus, they're going to crucify you. And Jesus laid down his life, so you got to lay down your life. And I remember when I first became a local pastor, I was sitting at a Buffalo Wild Wings bar to watch an A&M football game, my alma mater, because we don't have cable TV. And I also had my journal where I scribble out my different sermon notes. And this older lady was sitting next to me, and she saw my notebook, and she goes, "You must be a pastor." It's like, "How can you tell?" And she said, "Because only pastors write notes like that." And she said, "My dad was a pastor." And I said, "Well, this is great, because I'm becoming a local church pastor for the first time. I've got 2 daughters. My 3rd daughter is going to be born next month. What's the one piece of advice that you can give me for a dad of daughters as a pastor?" And she, without hesitation, she just said, "I wish my dad had loved and spent as much time with us as he did with the church."
Yeah.
And here's the part that do what you want with it, but when I have had to do ministry, I've had 2 or 3 weddings that I've done where the bride, this was their second marriage, and they had come out of some sort of emotional, verbal, or maybe even physical abusive marriage, and they were in a different, denominational tradition, and they had been. They would come to me and ask about getting remarried and how I felt about it, because their traditions had said, well, if you didn't commit adultery, too bad. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you took a vow, and that's just the way husbands are sometimes, or boys will be boys. And we would never, at least I would hope, as good Wesleyan Methodist ministers, never counsel somebody that way. We would say that is abuse and you've got to get out. And then I realized, as I started my own therapy journey in all this, that, in our tradition in United Methodism, man, the ordination process is soul crushing. It's intended to be. And the way that bishops and district superintendents and church boards and committees, and you would sit with other clergy who were going through this with you, and we'd all have the same horror stories. And then you would have the folks who had gone before us, and they would always say some version of the same thing. Well, that's just how bishops operate. Well, that's just how cabinets do things. Well, that's just how SPRCs have always been. And then they would say, you took a vow at ordination. And I'm like, hold on here. You're just gaslighting me into another form of abuse. And if you try to push back on that, you would get Jesus laid down his life. There's a fine line between sacrificial giving and abuse. And there's a fine line between, I am trying to be like Jesus, I'm being formed into the image of Jesus, and I am Jesus. And to be formed into the image of Jesus means to be formed into having his holy love for God and for others and for yourself. And if you can't love yourself enough to say, this is going to kill me, and destroy my family, then you need to recalibrate this.
Yeah.
And it sounds like in essence, that's kind of what you did.
Yeah. And I think in many ways, I'm still doing, because I had a conversation this morning with a church member about trying to plan for ministry and this kind of post-COVID reality of a healthy church that's growing with less people, which is weird because, for my church, we have more active adults now than we did before COVID, but engagement and attendance and all those things have just changed so dramatically that we're having to find ways to do more with less. And it's weird because everything's up and to the right, except for the amount of people you have for things. And I told her, I said, we live in this super busy, hurried world, and we have to find ways to call that out. But we also have to find ways to work against that current. But we also have to work with that current because we don't want to throw things out. For me, so much of my ministry for years was based off of this phrase. I said it back on the podcast years ago. It'd be all aboard the hustle bus. And it's when I talk about my own value statements, I would walk into a room feeling adequate, but then I'd be like, okay, you might be smarter, you might know, but I guarantee you I can work harder than you can.
Right.
And so, just massive journey. So much of that kind of stuff, it's okay, I had to process my way through that, but then also, now what does it mean for me to be the host and the convener of a place and a community for pastors to be, rather than a business conference, it's like an AA meeting.
Dude.
To be okay, these are these practices. Now me as a ministry leader, because my ministry became strong because I could work hard and I was creative. That was the story of the first half of my life and what I've spent the last 2 years of doing. And it's an ever moving journey. And it's a journey that still is a day-to-day journey is now finding that line between still, my strength finder, my number one gift is strategic. My top 5 are strategic, activator, maximizer, significance, and futuristic. That sort of thing hasn't changed. I've got a very forward motion, fast focused personality. That's who I am. That's who Jesus made me to be.
Right.
But how am I called to do that in a healthy way?
And can I say something to that last part you just said? First, I want to say hi, my name's Omar, and I'm a productive pastor. Hello, Omar. You said this is, these are my strengths finders numbers, and you have, everybody has their sort of, whether it's the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs or strengths finders or whatever. But one of the things that I have realized as a local church pastor, I preached my first sermon when I was a sophomore in high school. I have been in ministry, whether it's been officially called ministry or I've been paid for it, really for over 30 years. And I'm only 48 years old. And so one of the things that I would, when I first got into this, after doing 20 years of student campus ministry, I was like, I can't do this. This is not in my skill set. This is not in my, as they say, in my wheelhouse or whatever. And I got this phrase or some version of it all the time, the classic, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called.
Yeah.
And I found that that's BS. That is not really scriptural, because if you look at the stories of some of our heroes in the Bible, like Moses, yes, he had a meek personality or maybe a stutter, but he had grown up in Pharaoh's household. God didn't just call average Joe Israelite, because only Moses could get through the front door. Only Moses knew where the halls of power were. David and Goliath. Yes, God won the victory, but he didn't just win it by suddenly giving David these magical slingshot abilities. He won it because David had spent years as a shepherd fine tuning, as Malcolm Gladwell talks about in his book David and Goliath, fine tuning the ability to precision hit a target from 200 yards away with a sling that would have the same impact as a 22 caliber bullet.
Mm-hmm.
Even Peter, I'm going to make you fishers of men. That as a fisherman back then, that was really a job nobody wanted, because they had this theological fear of the water. And so to be a fisherman meant you were already going to go where no one else wanted to go. And that's what ends up happening with Peter and the other apostles. And so this idea that God just takes a person and calls them to do something that they're incapable of doing, and then says, I'm going to give you the way to do it. Yeah, that does happen sometimes. And I found that it's a particular personality that can do that, a particular gift set. And side note, those are the ones who end up growing really large churches and then publish leadership books on how you're supposed to do it their way. But they're only published because they have large churches. That's how the publishing industry works. But Moses and David and Peter, like all these guys, they had part of the way they were created by God, and then their experiences that gave them some bit of qualification that then God was able to use and manifest for the bigger story. And I think that also becomes part of how pastors get crushed in this, is because they're like, well, you signed up for this, and don't worry, God's going to equip the called. Well, if that's not my personality, or if I have a mental illness, and you're just throwing the church industrial complex leadership books at me, well, then you're setting both of us up for lifelong failure.
Yeah. And that's, the thing that's been part of Productive Pastor since the very beginning is, what does it look like for us to I'm a big fan. It wasn't out years ago when the podcast started. He was writing at the time, and I would link to his articles at times. But James Clear wrote that book, Atomic Habits.
Yes, I have a half-read copy.
I love that mentality, because this is the thing: who God makes us to be as leaders is unique. Like, I don't want to jump too much into Strength Finders modeling, but like, there's 4 domains. One of them is executing domain. There's 34 strengths. I do not have an executing strength until number 17, which makes most people look at me like, how on earth? Because new church start, was growing rapidly for a long time. Our capital campaign process that I led was one of the largest new church capital campaign processes. Like we were told that our pledge goal was $125,000.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the consultant told us would be a good pledge goal. We pledged $320,000.
Wow.
Like all aboard the hustle bus kind of thing. Because that's who I was. And so most people look at me like, well, how on earth do you do all of this when you have no executing strengths? Because I don't. But like, God wired me to do a certain thing. God wired you, Omar, to do a certain thing, to do certain things in a certain way. And we can do anything. And anybody listening to this, like, you can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you do it will be entirely unique to you.
Right.
And where I find, Productive Pastor has a nice ring to it. I don't think that title really encapsulates, especially now, but we're using it because we got it. We're using it. But instead, it's like, what does it look like for us to learn to leverage the things that we are really good at, that fill us with love, that fill us with passion? They're the reasons we got into ministry, that whole 9 yards. What does it look like for us to realize that, hey, if as a normal church pastor, I've got 170 people in my church. As a normal church pastor, there's going to be things I'm going to have to do that I don't want to do, that are not inside of my skill set, that are going to cause anxiousness in my life. But I've got to learn my way to hack through them in a way that makes them not take up the predominant amount of my work week. Because that's the thing. If you're not good at something and it does not energize you, you're going to take longer to do it.
Right.
And so there are some very tactical I'm making air quotes right now, productive ways to get around this stuff. But for me, this is about creating margin for us to do the things that we love, that energize us, and that are the best offerings that we can give to the communities that we lead, because that's who God made us to be. And so that's like when I'm jumping back into this, it's like, okay, post-COVID world, the landscape's completely changed. The strategies behind it are completely different. And there's things that we can teach, that we can talk about. Like communication. Communication is it is so important now, like dramatically important. Okay, let's talk about how the everyday pastor can communicate really well in ways that are inexpensive, are free, and are deeply strategic.
Right.
Because most people now, you can communicate to them 15 times about something and they're not going to know it. And whereas 3 years ago I said, well, let's just try this thing, and like I'm always kind of edging out. I said, no, they're just not going to hear it. No matter what you do, they're not going to hear it. Let's deal with it and move past things.
Right.
That's my, an A is an A. Like I went to high school with a kid who got a 36 on his ACT, but didn't have a perfect 36. He wanted to go back and get a perfect 36. He got his cumulative score was a 36. So he had like a 36, 36, a 35, and a 36, like something stupid like that. Right. And he went back to get a perfect 36. We will exhaust ourselves in ministry going back to get a perfect 36 when a 30 will get you into any university in the world.
What was it JD used to say? Great is the enemy of good enough. Yes.
Yeah. And here's the thing. He would say that, and I would be the person that would be fighting that battle. For years, I would be the first. Like my wife and I, we're still, I am a perfectionist. My wife is a perfectionist. That is a spiritual battle to me now.
Right.
Because Meredith and I used to say, the difference between good and great is the last 10%.
Right.
I have learned how to be a 90% person now.
Right.
I've learned how to be an 80% person now. And there's things about it that, that drive me crazy that are just there. It's not whole. So what is it, like I said earlier, what does it mean for this community to come back full force, probably better than ever? And rather than it being like a business seminar, it's instead now an AA meeting.
Right. And the thing about recovery is that there's everybody comes in and is in the same boat, and there's no judgment, there's no competition, there's no, they say no crosstalk, there's no fixing. There's just giving space for people to share where they are along the journey, and that somehow helps bring recovery. And I think about that phrase, great is the enemy of good enough, and where you bristled at that because that's who you are, or that's how you felt wired. I found so much freedom in that phrase, because one of the things, I have adult ADHD and depression, persistent depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. And I didn't have any vocabulary or diagnosis or medication or management for those things until I was out of seminary.
Yeah.
And one of the things that crushes somebody with those issues, and a lot of pastors have those issues, is that we know what great looks like, but our brain is an organ just like the heart is an organ or the pancreas is an organ. And if it's broken, like, you can't do what you see other people doing.
Yeah. But you also, and this is where I've got this project that I will never start, that I would love to probably, at first I thought it could be a sermon series, and it just won't be good enough to be a sermon. It's just, it's too much to be a sermon series. So maybe one day somebody's going to pay me money to write a book about it. But it's a biblical theology of happiness.
Huh.
And, so much has been done in the last 5 or 6 years from a spiritual perspective about neuroplasticity.
Right.
And, you bring in the the neuroplasticity stuff into spiritual formation. And that's the thing, is like, there's wirings that make people pastors. There's wirings that make people like new church planners like me,
right?
That make people like heavy forward momentum people like me. There's wirings that make folks fantastic pastoral care pastors and shepherds. I'm jealous. I have no empathy in my body. Like, I need some of those skills. I just don't have them at all. So I have to focus. Like for me, an hour-long pastoral care conversation will spend me for the rest of the day.
Right.
Like, I'm done. Like, if I schedule a conversation or meeting with somebody like that, where I know that's going to be a thing, if that happens in the morning, I just have to go home in the afternoon.
Right.
Because I'm spent. So I've got to, this is kind of one of those little hacks. Like, I know now, if I have a conversation like that, that's planned, sometimes those conversations aren't planned, but if I have a conversation and I can plan when that happens, I try to do that mid-afternoon.
Right.
Because I'll be present for it. I'll be able to. And generally, if I've had the right kind of morning, I'll be in a really, really good mental state for that conversation. Mm-hmm. But then I can also walk out of that conversation knowing, okay, I don't have like 2 or 3 or 4 mission critical tasks ahead of me that I just do not have the energy space. And so, like, that's the change agent. Like, I used to call those things time bombs.
I remember that.
I used to call those things time bombs, and I hate that. There's several phrases that were part of my vocabulary for years that I'm embarrassed about now, because it's just, I know the space those were coming from.
Right.
And I'm in a process. I don't want to say I am healed, because I will always be in a healing process for my entire life against my workaholism and my journey to find my worth and my ability to work hard. But I've been able to come through that enough to be highly aware of that.
What you're essentially doing is you're reclaiming or redeeming what the word or the phrase productive pastor implies.
Yeah.
And that productive pastor never was supposed to mean what we think it means. And I know we got to be wrapping up here pretty soon. And the other questions I had, you kind of already answered them throughout this, but I'm going to throw this out there for your listeners, because this is what has helped save me. Was there's a story in Acts chapter 6. This is after Pentecost. It's after the apostles are teaching and preaching throughout Jerusalem. The numbers of believers are growing. People are selling their property, selling their goods, bringing it to the storehouse for the food, for the poor. And we have our first church conflict where the Greek widows and the Hebrew widows are arguing, thinking each other got more food than the other one. And they bring it to the apostles. And there's this great line, depending on the translation you're looking at, it says the apostles said, "We were not called to run a food pantry. We were not called to wait on tables. Let's pray and find those that the Holy Spirit has created to do that. Lay hands on them and let them do it." And it lists the 6 or 7 people they find. They lay hands on them. They send them to do it. And, one of those guys was Philip. Mm-hmm. And Philip ends up being one of doing something before the apostles even did it, which is getting out of Jerusalem and becoming a missionary.
Yeah.
And I think that part of our old ways of thinking about being a productive pastor and that Jesus complex is that we're supposed to do or lead or have our hands on everything. And all we do is exacerbate the clergy laity divide of the church industrial complex, as opposed to empowering those to do what they've been called to do or created to do. Yeah. And we don't know how that might lead to something even further down the road.
Because in our own, I don't understand this yet. I would love to have the clarity to understand more about it. It's something I'm seeking right now. But I know I can be a bottleneck. Mm-hmm. And like you look at the story that you just read, I loved how you didn't go to Stephen, you went to Philip.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the apostles had the bravery. That's the biggest thing, is the bravery, which, I mean, you want to get into Friedman's language of self-differentiation and call and that kind of stuff. But here's the thing, to self-differentiate in that level, people have to know and this is where kind of that weird, the hustle tension comes in. Like when people know you've got a proven track record with something, they're willing to make, your leaders are willing to make this time in this space. And that when there's a level of care and trust, like, and also I'm probably going to shoot myself in the Methodist foot right now. I realize there's a lot of pastors who are not Methodists who listen to this, but especially for us, like, like our tenure and our itinerancy system, it stops us from ever having this level of trust in our leaders.
Right.
But the bravery of the apostles to make that statement, but then you see them lead that spiritually. And you see, like, I love that story in Acts 6 because the level of blessing and care that they're looking at for people to watch the table service is higher than the level of blessings and care that we probably sometimes attach to being called to be pastors.
Right. They weren't doing it as hey, that's not my job.
No, it's like that story. That's the thing. Yeah, exactly. Because like when we say, oh, it's not my job, I'm not going to do it. It's not my job. Like I've seen that destructive behavior in my own life. I've seen that destructive behavior around me through others and through people I've worked with. Like us just throwing up that passive aggressive, that's not my job. Like that doesn't fly.
Well, that's because that's what they're, I think the heart behind what they're saying is like, look, this is important work. This is kingdom work. And we, if we do it, it's not going to go well.
Yeah.
And so
because it's about like as Wesleyans, Omar, we have to deal with, we run away from the idea of mild determinism.
Right.
And we run away from the idea of, and we don't have a rubric. Like whenever I talk about, I know I'm called to do this inside of, like, especially like denominational institutional systems, they look like, oh, well, no, we don't believe in that. Like we've got to understand that God calls people to certain things. God releases people to certain things. And when we begin realizing that's not just inside of our church as pastors, but that's inside of our leadership, our boards, our systems, our structures, that sort of thing. Like what you see the disciples do in that moment is they say, hey, if I keep on doing this, this will not be who I am. And we will not find the people that need to do this to unlock who they are supposed to be.
Exactly.
So this is where you see the Phillips and the Stephens.
Right.
Would they have gone and done those things if they had never been table service?
Exactly. And let me give your listeners a tactile way to do this in our current world and systems. You know, if you're a Methodist like you and I are, the itinerant system, I know other listeners have completely different ways of doing this, but this was I know of a pastor in my conference who got their new appointment to their new church, and they met with their church's committee on, for the very first time. And this pastor passed out index cards. I don't know how many were there. Let's say there were 9 people there, okay, on this committee. Passed out index cards to each of them and said, I want each of you, don't put your names on this, but I want each of you to write down the top 5 expectations and responsibilities you have for me as your pastor. And then they took, the pastor took them all up and then wrote all 45 of them on the board. And I think with the exception of preaching, okay, there were 45 different expectations and responsibilities, which no person can do.
No.
And then the pastor wrote their own 5 on the board and said, these are the 5 things that I offer. The rest of this is for y'all to figure out how to get done.
Yeah. And I've heard that story before. in a couple of different ways. And I think that whoever was the first one to do it and to tell it, I think a lot of people have done it since then. But one of the versions I heard about that also was that they asked them to put a time expectation next to those things. And they circled like the average of what people wanted them to do. They circled the time too. And they're like, okay, so, hey, if I do what you expect me to do, this has me working 70 hours a week.
Right.
And so that's, I mean, we've digressed off into that, but, I think that that's just, us realizing that call to leadership and to pulling the Spirit up out of our church through the people that are already here is us believing deeply in the incarnated presence and the mission of Jesus Christ with who we have. Because when we begin the preacher hustle culture also is one where you're never satisfied with who you have now. You're always thinking about who's not here. And
robs the people who are.
Exactly. You can have significant evangelistic zeal, which I have. Like you pull my APES stuff I'm a teacher and I'm an evangelist. But it's another lesson I've learned the last few years. Like, you've got to look at who you have now, because you are a pastor to the people that you have every week. And that's we're not going to go down that road. We could be on the phone for an hour. We'll go down that road at a later date.
Well, dude, you're back. Backstreet's back. All right. I'm excited to have you back. I think that what you have experienced and how the Lord can use that and speak through that is what a lot of people in ministry need right now. I know I need it. I feel like our conversation has just affirmed a lot in me. And so welcome back, man, and thanks for letting me be the first one through the door to reverse the tables here and interview you.
Well, I knew that I needed to have, and I want to talk just briefly about what things are going to look like, but I knew that I wanted to have a very personal level of explanation of this. And my thought was, I need to find somebody who knows me really, really well, who's a good friend, who's known me for a long time, and for this just to be a conversation. And so you were the first person on my list. I appreciate that.
Yeah, take that, much. Drew and Josh. So yeah, what is coming up? What can we expect now that this is coming back in a new way?
So the landscape of podcasting has changed remarkably in the last few years, to the point to where it's people are okay sometimes going a little while between episodes. And so this is what I'm doing, and this is a way where I can manage this well according to my schedule and my time, but also kind of hit 2 or 3 islands that matter to me. And so this is what things are going to look like. We're going to have 2 different kinds of episodes in Productive Pastor World now. We've got interludes and we've got seasons. And so, like right now, this is an interlude episode. I released an episode, a short one, just a couple weeks before this releases. And then there's this one, which will probably end up being an hour and 15-minute long episode when my front end stuff and back end stuff is done, and our conversation, which has been golden, is there. And then in December, I'm launching season 1, and season 1 is going to be a rehashing of, some kind of basic practices. And, rather than me just re-releasing all of the old school stuff, that was 8 years ago. Stuff has changed. Stuff isn't the same. The world's different, whole 9 yards. And it's going to be like 11 of just basic productivity practices and understandings about time management and like schedule organization, that sort of a thing. And they're going to build off of each other. I'm also releasing a workbook that's going to go alongside. So if you want to buy that workbook, I'm not sure how much it's going to cost right now. It's going to be cheap. It's not going to be outrageously expensive. Like there'll be like worksheets and stuff to go through every single episode. The first half is going to be literally scheduling and understanding like scheduling and how scheduling changes things. And the other 6 things after that are going to be some more high level practices of things. And so that's probably going to run, depending on what my production schedule's like, it might run weekly. It'll probably run bi-weekly. And so that'll carry it for a few months. And then after that, we're going to hit another interlude season. And what I'm hoping to do in that interlude season is to have more conversations like I'm having with you right now, or to bring on these other people that I know that have just, really good way. My friend Fernie might be listening to this. Fernie's a church planter down in Baton Rouge. Fernie's new church was scheduled to launch the Sunday the governor shut the state down in Louisiana for COVID.
Dope.
And Fernie has thrived for the last year and a half. It has completely changed the model to what new churches look like. And has been reaching tons of 20-somethings in Baton Rouge, like professionals graduated from school, working first jobs, second jobs, that sort of a thing. It's Fernie's discipleship. So that's amazing. So like, I'm going to pull Fernie in for an episode and just like highlight these ways that Fernie's thinking about this, but also know that Fernie's thinking about this in a healthy way. So seasons are going to be focused. They're going to be super deliberate. They're going to be tactical. They're going to have resources attached to them. And interludes are these times in between to where I'm really just wanting to get people that I listen to and I pay attention to on the horn, not chasing after the big people. Anyway, I had Carrie Newhoff on the podcast years ago before Carrie was really even a big deal.
I remember that.
I'm not chasing the big interviews. It's instead, who are the normal everyday pastors that people can learn from and that are already kind of part of the crew already. And so, looking at doing those sorts of episodes. So, December is when season 1's going to launch. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I've been working on that stuff I've been working on that content for almost a year. I'm really excited about it.
Well, Chad, you are a man among boys. Thanks for letting me do this.
Well, Omar, it is just fantastic to have you as part of this story. So.
All right, man. Cool.
So there you have it. That conversation was fantastic. I've enjoyed just being able to listen to it again, the interplay back and forth, but also just the story that I didn't really realize was almost as big of a deal as it was. So season 1 starts in just a couple of weeks. You can find show notes at revchadbrooks.com. And closing out, would love for you to come hang out with us in the Productive Pastor Podcast community. You can find them on Facebook. And also, don't forget to sign up for the email list. I'm also giving away my brand new day sheet when you join up for that, and that's going to be a big part of season 1. So make sure you grab a hold of that. I can't wait for season 1. It's going to be super cool. But I'm Chad. Thanks so much for sticking around for the podcast this long, and I will see you back in the next episode.